At the end of part 2, I talked about Gregory Schopen's argument that the Buddha image was first created by orthodox nuns and monks. As I suggested, this was a revisionist position, i.e. it questioned an accepted truth. But it wasn't a revisionist position that was adopted in isolation. The 1980s saw a series of profound shifts in the study of Buddhist history and a trend for revisionism. Nothing was off limits, and people began to question everything in the field. What the best evidence to study Buddhism was, when the Buddha had lived, if the figure in our texts was more a literary character than a faithful record of the historical person, and so on. And amongst these revisionist positions, we get two important articles, which, much like Coomaraswamy's contributions in the 20s, are not things you need to read. The first by John Huntington in 1985, and the second by Susan Huntington in 1990, in which they argued, essentially, that everything I've told you up to this point is wrong. The subsequent literature has become known as the Aniconism debate, and it got really unpleasant very quickly. You can and should read about the early debate in a paper by Rob Lynn-Roth. Why did it get so nasty? Well, revisionism tends to provoke reaction. People feel threatened when established truths are challenged, and for it to happen on a question which has contemporary resonance, like the origin of the Buddha image, well, it would have been surprising if it hadn't got heated. Let me start by summarising Susan Huntington's position, and I'm going to focus on Susan Huntington as hers is the more important contribution. This can be divided, I believe, into four related but distinct arguments. Most controversially, that there was no aniconic period. Secondly, that the Buddha is not represented by symbols. Third, that the boundary between aniconic and iconic is very unclear. And fourth, that in any case, aniconic is a deeply unhelpful term. I have arranged those points from most controversial and least well-grounded through to vital insights that everyone who is interested in this subject should pay attention to. The first argument is completely unsound. It is an example of how once a fashion for revisionism takes hold, people will often raise questions even in the face of actual evidence. Let me just remind you, aniconic is used to describe a period in Buddhist art from which no images of the Buddha in human form survive. Our earliest Buddhist art is centuries older than the earliest images of the Buddha, and that is about as well established by evidence as these things ever can be. But there is room for nuance, and the second and third arguments do have some merit. Looking at the classic examples of symbolic images, worshippers gathered around trees or wheels, Susan Huntington writes, all we needed to do was look at the art and observe what was actually depicted. The scenes with Buddha figures and the depictions with stupas, trees, and other motifs represent entirely different subject matter. Okay, so if a tree or a wheel is not a symbolic representation of the Buddha, which most people did assume it was, what does it in fact represent? Huntington's answer is simple. Exactly what they appear to: trees and wheels. These are not images of a past event in which a symbol is substituted for the Buddha. They are images of contemporary events in which worshippers pay homage to something that commemorates the Buddha or his teachings. And this helps explain why such images continue to be made in places where the Buddha is depicted in human form. And I would suggest to you that it is almost certainly true in many cases. But Huntington does overstate it. This explanation just does not work for scenes like the Great Departure at Sāñchi. Yes, in principle, a horse, an umbrella, footprints, etc. could be part of a contemporary act of worship or reenactment, but 4 divine spirits holding the horse's hooves are not. And importantly, this argument would not eliminate the aniconic phase. It just changes the question. Instead of why was the Buddha image created, it would become why did people start to depict past rather than contemporary events. Though that's not an insignificant change. Often getting a good answer is about asking the right questions. So with that in mind, let us consider the third argument. When I introduced the evidence, I focused on time. The depictions without a Buddha image at Sāñchi and Bharhut are earlier, 2nd century BC to 1st century AD, than the depictions with an image from the 2nd century AD from Mathura, Swat and Gandhara. But they are also from different places, and the art of Mathura, Swat and Gandhara appears to have only had an iconic phase. As far back as we can trace, people making Buddhist art in those places made images of the Buddha. In fact, the only site I can think of where there is a marked shift from an aniconic to an iconic phase is Amaravati, and here we run into some of the limits of my own reading. Most people I know think highly of Akira Shimada's work, but I haven't read it myself. All of which raises the question of whether the differences really are about two phases, or whether they might be matters of geography, local artistic practice, or sectarian affiliation. Which brings us to Huntington's final argument, that a lot of this misunderstanding derives from the deeply unhelpful term aniconic. There is nothing aniconic about an image of a tree or a footprint, and it's really weird to use a Christian term that is often associated with Islamic reluctance to depict human forms for crowded depictions of people in Buddhist art. Huntington herself says, the apparent absence of terminology within the Indic and Buddhist contexts that corresponds to the imported iconic and aniconic language is to me a red flag. Words do not stand in isolation, but rather reflect complicated mental constructs and cultural conceptualizations. Take, for example, the video I mentioned in part 1 by the channel Doug's Dharma. If you watch that, you will see the presenter keeps falling into talking about Christian and Islamic ideas and idolatry. But all those concepts post-date the events we are trying to understand, and they are all alien to Buddhism. So either we have to dump the terminology entirely, or we have to be very careful about defining what exactly we mean by aniconic. Always remain aware that it has nothing to do with other uses of the word we might encounter. This last argument of Huntington's is the most important, and is the focus of an article she wrote in 2015 entitled Shifting the Paradigm. Yes, 2015 is the same year as both De Caroli's Image Problems and the book by Fogel and I recommended in part 2. Weird coincidence, huh? Time, I think, for a conclusion. In part 1, I explained that something very profound happened to Buddhism around the beginnings of the 2nd century AD, and finished today with an argument by Susan Huntington that suggests it is hard to tell what that profound thing was. So not only have I not given you an answer as to why the Buddha image was created, I've suggested we might not even be asking the right questions. Certainly, the view that held sway at the beginning of the 20th century, that the first images of the Buddha were created by Greek patrons in Gandhara, is almost certainly wrong. The evidence has moved on a lot, and the scholarship has laid bare some of the assumptions of cultural superiority that underpin that idea. But no, I don't actually have an answer, and that is why this video has been in 3 parts, and I've recommended 10 articles and sections of 3 books to cover just a basic introduction. That reflects a truth about historical scholarship. If good scholars have spent a century trying to solve a problem and haven't succeeded, then there probably isn't a simple solution. Take the most recent contributions in 2015. Vogelin's suggestion that it was learned monks raises another question as to why monks would suddenly change their attitude to images in the early 2nd century AD. De Caroli's suggestion of a shift in the zeitgeist is really interesting. It explains why the first images might appear independently in different regions. But if, as De Caroli suggests, it was a pan-Indian shift, why are there no distinct origins in the Middle Ganges, Maharashtra or Andhra? Why only in the northwest? So these are valuable contributions, but not complete answers. And so it remains an open and important question. What precisely happened? Why did it happen in particular places? Why did the use of images spread so quickly and so widely? If I were trying to answer that question, and I'm not, then the way I would approach it would be similar to the structure of these 3 episodes. Evidence, interpretation and questions. And those form a sort of circle, in which you look at evidence to answer the question, and secondary literature to inform your understanding of the evidence. And that raises more questions, which you then try to answer by looking at the evidence again. The attempts to do that in 2015 all fell short, but maybe that is not a lack of evidence. Maybe today we do have enough to solve this problem, and maybe someone will. Maybe that someone is you. Anyway, thank you for listening.